Hexerei buffs have been around for a while now, and today I wanted to talk about them a little bit. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. Okay, so making a video like this after the travesty that was Varka is a little bit funny, but I do want to say something really quick. I don't think that Varka is bad because of Hexerei. The actual mechanic of Hexerei itself has literally nothing to do with why Varka is bad. His own numbers are just too low. That has basically always been the issue. He just doesn't do damage. And because we don't necessarily have a true, fully fledged Hexerei buffer yet, his full potential has not yet been tapped in on. Now, whether Hoyoverse is ever going to truly tap into that potential, I don't know. I'm personally going to be holding out hope until the end of 6.x, otherwise I just don't think it's coming. But in any case, I don't necessarily think that him being bad, or not bad, but rather just serviceable or underwhelming, I feel like those would be better terms, has nothing to do with how good or bad Hexerei ended up being. Because Varka's problems are literally mostly just related to his damage, not the actual Hexerei mechanic itself. I think that Hexerei itself is honestly really good. I just wanted to clear that up because I know that talking about this when Varka ended up being really bad is kind of funny, but the actual idea behind Hexerei and the actual execution of it, I actually think was really good. And the reason I also wanted to talk about this is because I personally think that Hexerei is a lot more interesting than Lunar reactions. In the current Genshin 6.x meta, I feel like Lunar reactions are very rigid. It's very put two and two together. And you could argue that plenty of teams in Genshin are like that. It's usually pretty obvious who is to be used with who. But even so, I feel like most Lunar teams are very set in stone, and you can definitely swap certain units here and there, but for the most part, they're very fixed. I feel like with Hexerei teams, there's a lot more flexibility, and it's overall just a lot more interesting to me personally. I don't want to outright call all of the Lunar meta boring or bad. I really enjoy my Flins personally, but I do still think that it is fair to say that it's definitely very rigid. This much is fair in my opinion. I feel like Hexerei buffs are less rigid in that sense. You're able to buff up older characters' teams with these Hexerei characters, for example using Durin and Albedo for Navia teams. And I also just think the actual idea behind Hexerei was really good. Regional buffs. Regional direct character buffs. That is a really good idea to provide kit reworks and buffs. They managed to turn Venti from a really niche pull that just didn't really have any major justifiable reason to get him other than he's peak and cute, to a character that is actually a really formidable Animo DPS. We are living in a timeline where Venti is actually a really solid DPS in the meta, and that's so nice for me to see because I love Venti. So that in of itself is really awesome to see. These old characters that most people didn't really have a use for that have been sitting around collecting dust on their accounts for so long can now be used again. And that is a really, really cool thing. So I personally think that going forward, Genshin should definitely continue with these buffs. I also think they were very reasonable with who they selected for the buffs. They left out Bennett, which completely makes sense because that character just doesn't really need a Hexerei buff, like, at all. And they're also likely leaving that slot open in Varka's team for another 5-star, Copium. Anyways. But it took a bunch of characters that generally just needed the help and gave them the help. It was a really good idea, and I think now that we are where we are, I can safely say Hexerei is probably the best thing to come out of Genshin 6.x's meta, and I do personally like it a lot more than the Lunar reactions. So, all around, I think this was a really, really well-executed thing. The only thing that really stains it, in my opinion, is unfortunately the fact that Varka released in such a poor state. Like, he's not even the worst thing ever. If you have his signature, I've said this time and time again, he's serviceable. He's probably never going to be meta, but he's serviceable at the very least. But unfortunately, for the premium Hexerei DPS, he just feels really underwhelming. So, unfortunately, I can see some people looking at that and just thinking that was a really underwhelming way to provide the next step in the Hexerei team core. This is why I'm really convinced that the Hexerei team core just isn't finished yet. I have a really hard time believing it's all said and done now. But the nice thing is, even if they messed up with Varka, at the very least, this doesn't devalue the fact that all of the other characters who got Hexerei buffs added to their kit got some genuinely meaningful help. It's not like these characters just kind of had something slapped on and it barely helped them and now they barely have any meta presence. No, these are actually good buffs. And I should also mention that these buffs were able to contribute something to the ongoing meta right now. If you don't have Inefa and you're running free-to-play Flins, then your Fischl and Sucrose are now just suddenly stronger for his team, so his free-to-play team just randomly got an upscale, which is super nice. And I feel like nobody actually saw this coming at the time whenever it was first added, because, goodness me, Genshin had literally never done direct character buffs before. The only time they had ever changed a character's kit this much was Zhongli, and that was ages ago. But this is a very interesting way to implement it, and I feel like since we've had some time to play around with it now, I feel like this is how I want them to go about character buffs in the future. Give us more regional buffs. Once we're done with Mondstadt, we go on to Liyue, then we go on to Inazuma, and it just continues until we eventually have buffs for all characters that currently feel underwhelming and could definitely use the help. So, all around, I feel like this is an idea that has a lot of potential, and just because Varka was messed up doesn't necessarily reduce my goodwill towards Hexerei specifically, because I will be honest, I wasn't expecting Hexerei, but it was really good, though with Lunar reactions, I'm not the biggest fan of how things have been handled. I don't think it's completely unsalvageable, nor do I think that it's way too high cost for anybody to get into. Characters like Jabai exist. Columbina is probably one of the most skippable Archon releases we've ever had. And with Flins, if you get his C1, you can perfectly skip out on Inefa, and even if you have him C0, he is still holding up just fine. And like I mentioned, his free-to-play team recently got an upscale. I would say the only other character that's really in a bad position without their full premium team is Nafer. And even for her, you can skip out on Columbina. It's mostly Lauma you really want for her. So I honestly don't want to criticize the Lunar meta as being some completely unsalvageable poop, because there are very reasonable avenues that you can take, and you can very much easily get your foot through the door in this meta without having to invest a lot. Jabai is the easiest way to get into the Lunar meta without really having to commit all that much. You can literally use a 3-star weapon on her, and then pull literally no other 5 stars, and you're fine. So, to be frank, I actually think the Lunar meta isn't as bad as I've seen some people say, because there are ways you can work around it, and there are cheaper ways that you can manage it. So, in fairness, I don't actually think it's the worst thing ever, but I will say this. I don't think the Lunar meta is anywhere near as creative as Hexerei is. I feel like Hexerei is some new ground, we have literally never seen it before, and it's just much more interesting to me. When I look at Hexerei, I'm like, okay, there is some real potential here, this is super interesting. Whereas with Lunar teams, they're very predictable. It is really cool to me that we have things like Lunar Crystallize and that Bloom is meta again and such, but even so, I still feel like the concept and idea of Hexerei is just more unique and interesting. But obviously, what is an interesting idea if it's not executed well? But like I've said up until this point, I honestly think it was executed just fine. It actually synergizes with a good amount of teams, the actual Hexerei units themselves happen to be pretty good in a wide variety of scenarios, and I really don't have much of her feedback than I feel like Varka was terribly mishandled. That's the real negative here. If you're trying to invest into it to a premium level, it's just not that good to do at the minute because Varka just released in a very underwhelming state, almost as if the unit was basically incomplete without some other support that we just don't have yet. And like I said, I am pretty convinced we will get something like that at some point. I really hope that's the case. It would be pretty silly to me if that isn't the case, but I do think we will eventually get some other support for him. So maybe this isn't the end of the road for him here just yet, but either way, baseline Hexerei is super free-to-play friendly, and then if you try to invest more into it, it's the biggest waste of Primo Gems out of all of the 6.x characters at the minute. But the actual mechanic itself is good. Just because Varka did not release in a good state does not mean that Hexerei itself is bad, because like I said, I believe Varka's issues and Hexerei to be independent of each other. You could argue that maybe they should have given him a Hexerei talent that fixes most of his issues in his kit, and fine, I guess, but that just kind of goes back to the issue of Varka's numbers not being good enough. That has basically always been the inherent issue, and it's going to be the issue until we get a character that is able to make his numbers more acceptable for 6.x, because currently he is not meeting the standards of 6.x premium units. Either way, I can definitely see them doing something like this for Liyue next year. I assume they're probably going to roll this out year by year as older characters become more and more irrelevant, I personally feel like Genshin has always done a really good job of keeping older characters relevant in the meta. There's never really been a specific point in time where an old 5-star has been completely unable to clear as long as you have decent enough supports for them. But this is a really nice way to take those forgotten characters and just help them out. For example, sure, you probably could clear Abyss with Albedo before. There's nothing saying that you couldn't have done that. But you cannot deny that the Hexerei buffs were really good for him, and he is a character that seriously needed the help. Klee is another character who, okay, sure, she was usable before, but she also really needed the help. I think giving these buffs to these particular 5-stars that are super forgotten is really nice. I think it's super unfortunate, though, that Eula didn't get any Hexerei buff. I understand it's about characters linked to the Hexen Circle this time around, so okay, that makes sense. But it's still unfortunate because that is a Mondstadt character, and I do feel like she very much could have used the buff. So, unfortunate. But even so, the other two characters, they needed that help, man. And Fischl was obviously serviceable before. Pretty good unit, pretty flexible, all things considered. But even so, giving her the buffs was a really nice additional thing. So all around, I think Hexerei was handled really nicely. I like how it was executed, I like the idea behind it, and I hope they continue to expand it in an interesting way with future regions. I think it's a bit of a bummer that Eula in particular was left out because she could have used the buff too, but in any case, I think going forward, if they continue to implement buffs like this region by region, then older characters are never going to become truly obsolete, and I think that's really nice to see. I am praying that we get Ganyu and Xiao buffs in Liyue. I still think those two characters work fine on my account. I just really like those two, so I just want to see them be stronger because I like them. That's pretty much it. I'm biased, basically. And while Varka's case is really unfortunate, I don't think that he's ever truly going to be worth it because he's always going to be really expensive, and ultimately, if you already have Venti, you can just run Venti, Durin, Bennett, and then whoever the Hexerei buffer is, right? Like, you don't need to get Varka if all you're looking for is a strong Anemo DPS. You already have Venti as an option that is just a lot cheaper and is also very strong at the minute. So we'll see how strong Varka ends up being down the line if he ever ends up getting a buff. I sure do hope so. But at least as of now, we're gonna have to wait. But I will once again reiterate, I feel like Varka's flaws are very independent and they don't really affect my opinion of Hexerei as an idea on the whole. Hopefully this video was able to tell you how good I personally think Hexerei was handled. This has been Juice, signing out, and once again, Hoyoverse, give me Ganyu and Xiao buffs in Liyue, and I will be the happiest camper of them all.